Hello, everyone. I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox.
Today, I visit with my good friend and former colleague, Jared Connors. Jared is now with Ascent Compliance, and we take a deep dive into what to expect in 2025 around PFAS regulations and reporting, trade sanctions for the supply chain professional, and sustainability reporting, which will all come to the fore for the supply chain professional and indeed compliance professional. I know you'll enjoy it. 12 O'Clock High is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Before we get started, a word from our network sponsor, Ethico. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And I'm absolutely thrilled today to be with my good friend and former colleague, Jared Connors. Jared, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you, sir, and welcome to the sunshine.
Thank you. We are recording this, not live, but we're together live today in a recording studio in Phoenix. I'm here for a conference, and Jared was kind enough to drop in, and we're going to take a look at some of the things that are on his mind as we move towards the end of 2024, and some of the things that may be on his mind as we move forward, not only into a new administration, political administration after January 20, but also in 2025. So, Jared, first of all, could you remind our listeners of your current title and position?
Yeah, so I work for Ascent. My title there is Director of Product Compliance and Sustainability, and I'm a part of what we call the regulatory team. And what that means is that it's my job to understand the market, to look at regulations and what that means for organizations and how it's going to impact them and their data collection through their supply chains, but also where the market is heading on these regulations. And oftentimes you hear in sustainability there's the regulatory expectation and then there's what's actually happening in the market. So sometimes those are two different approaches out there. So it's really my job to make sure I understand and keep my finger on the pulse of the regulatory landscape and the market expectations.
Jared, let me start with some of the things that are either on front of your mind or perhaps more directly. What are some of the things that are on front of your clients' minds as we move into Q4 of 2024?
Yeah, number one in 2024 has been PFAS, forever chemicals, right? We're all hearing about these things. And if you're listening to this podcast right now at home, look around your kitchen and try to identify what might have PFAS in it. Everything from Scotch tape to maybe some glue or different substances that you might be touching, like a cable in the back of your microwave or stove, or you're probably not pulling your stove out to touch that, but you have PFAS all over around you in your life. And these forever chemicals have a lot of harm, reproductive harm. When they're in our water supply, it's estimated that about half of us out there in the population have PFAS in our bloodstream right now. And this is really impactful because them being called forever chemicals, it's called that for a reason, is because they stay there forever. It's very hard for them to degrade, to break down. And the new restrictions coming out, state level restrictions, federal restrictions, other geography restrictions on PFAS is causing a lot of alarm for organizations to understand.
Could you maybe start with the United States, both at the federal level and some of the key states in terms of the regulatory response?
Yeah, so Minnesota, obviously, the home of 3M, right? It's there for a reason, starting there. Maine, there's actually a lot of different states that are talking about PFAS restrictions at a state level. There's also obviously the Toxic Substance Control Act, the TSCA, and the restrictions on PFAS is a part of that. And TSCA's been around for a really long time. And so this is just another set of restrictions involved in that. And there's Canada. Canada came out and said, hey, we can't let America always upstage us. So we're gonna be the first one with this report obligation in 2025 and not too many months from now. And if you're selling products into Canada, that's probably causing a lot of alarm for you. If you're selling products into Canada and you don't know about it, then you should be alarmed. And then obviously the EU will be behind that as well. But these restrictions mean that companies have to understand their use cases, and not a lot of organizations truly understand the nature of those use cases of PFAS.
Jared, is the protocol for starting to understand this assessing your own supply chain to determine what's in your supply chain, or is it something else?
It is about your supply chain. Most manufacturers today, like think of the automotive industry as an example, right? We call them automotive manufacturers. I think it's more appropriate to call them automotive assemblers, right? because they build Legos. They buy components. They buy the dashboard assembly from a supplier. They install it in an assembly line in Ohio or Mississippi or wherever they do that. And they may not necessarily know the material makeup of that, a subassembly, right? Tom and I right now are faced in front of two microphones, and there's a wire coming out of the back of these microphones, right? And I would bet that it's a pretty good possibility that that wire is coated with a material that has PFAS in it to make that a better long-lasting cable so it doesn't become brittle or crack or anything like that. And so most organizations do need to engage their supply chains because they don't know the material makeup of every single component within their bill of materials. Again, because they're buying sub-assemblies or they're buying components that are made up of different materials. And everybody probably has something from 3M in their supply chain at some point. And I can give you some stats. I have them up here. That's really interesting. We've had a number of customers over the 2024 coming to us for PFAS data collection. And we have over 2 million declarations in our database today for supporting PFAS investigations. 83% of the clients that are surveying through their suppliers to identify those where-used situations, the material makeup of their products, have found PFAS in their products. And that means about half of the declarations, so 1 million declarations, are showing that the suppliers that are providing the materials are either then investigating with their sub-tier suppliers or identifying direct use cases of PFAS. And this is really interesting because a lot of this is coming down to some very specific use cases of the PFAS materials. And in fact, it's 60% of the declaration are all from 5 different PFASs entirely. That means that it's a very common use in plasticizers or coating materials. If you think of any product that has a rubber O-ring or a wire harness assembly or is coated in some way or has plastic in it, you could be at risk for PFAS. And without the investigation through your supply chain, you may never know these, and you could face a restriction or an obsolescence issue.
After you've made that determination, is the next step to really remove those products from your supply chain, or is it another step in a risk management process?
You want to remove those substances from your product, and you want to start opening that dialogue with your suppliers about the possibility of doing that. So let's pick on Canada for a second, right? Canada says, hey, file a report. And companies are going through this process of filing for extensions on their report because, one, the conversation with their suppliers is so brand new, right? And two, the suppliers, their tier 1 suppliers, might not necessarily be the source of the PFAS. So once you start identifying it, like I said earlier, 80% of our suppliers or our customers that we're surveying suppliers for have found PFAS in their products. They have to work with those suppliers to specifically find out who in the value chain is providing that PFAS before they can start that kind of phase out, right? That obsolescence process of the PFAS material. It's not an overnight thing that companies can do this. And think about that PFAS is there for a reason, like my microphone example, right? So I make refrigeration hoses, let's say, okay? I have PFAS in that hose for a very good reason because of the temperature extremes. And so as I want to start to phase out the use of that PFAS material, I have to find a viable alternative. And I may not find a good enough alternative for some time, or I may not be able to find something. So I might have to essentially subject myself to a lesser than part, but I don't want to because I want to maintain my quality. That's a part of my brand. So these are going to take some time for organizations. So even though some of these restrictions aren't tomorrow, if you don't start investigating these things today, you're not going to have an adequate amount of time in order to be able to find those viable alternatives, to be able to phase those things out.
Jerry, let me change the topic just a little bit to sanctions and trade restrictions. What types of questions are you getting as we move into Q4 of this year?
Okay, so sanctions and trade restrictions, the good old world of responsible sourcing in general. This is really hot right now, and it's causing a lot of alarm for a large number and variety of companies. I will be the first to admit that when the EU instituted a iron and steel sanctions package, I said, this isn't going to affect that many manufacturers because it's going to be taken care of upstream of them, right? Those raw material producers are going to have to deal with this. And we've seen some of our customers, from the makers of snowmobiles, golf carts, spare parts for an MRI machine, playground equipment, you name it, getting stopped at the border. And people go, how is my harmonized tariff code, my CN code going into the EU is not a steel component? Why is it getting pulled over? Because you might be sending that into the EU disassembled, right? Steel poles, tubing for playground equipment. So you're not classifying it at that moment as playground equipment. It hasn't become playground equipment yet. It's steel tubing. The front end assembly on a golf cart, right? If that's disassembled or spare parts, that is a steel part, full stop. And so these things are getting restricted, and it's causing all these companies to rethink how they're sourcing or rethink the information that they get from organizations. And when you look at these trade restrictions on something as simple as steel and the impact it has, and then you kind of zoom out and you look at the rest of the periodic table of elements and the proliferation of geography-based and material-based trade restrictions and sanctions right now, nobody is immune to this, right? And again, if you say, I'm importing the laptop into the EU. That's an electronic component. I look at the regulation here and the requirements from the EU and the CN code, the harmonized tariff code that I'm importing this under as an electronic device. I don't have any issue. But what happens if I'm importing the components for that laptop, and one of them is an aluminum chassis, a shell for that laptop, and then I'm assembling that laptop in the European Union? You bet that aluminum shell could be an example of something that is restricted. In fact, here in the United States, there already is a restriction on aluminum, nickel, and copper coming out of the EU. Coming out of Russia. And soon the EU may say, we're going to follow suit with what the U.S. has done and take our trade restrictions beyond just steel and iron to those additional metals, so that they can support that kind of push for stopping the war effort in Ukraine, if you will.
So how do you, at this point, counsel clients? Is it a situation where they have to be cognizant of any new restrictions that may come up literally across the globe, or is it a response in another manner?
One of the most important questions I always ask at the beginning of every single call is, where do you buy from and where do you sell to, right? Understanding the movement of your goods, either raw materials, components, sub-assemblies, and then your finished good, is really critical to understanding where you're going to be impacted by a lot of these different regulations or trade restrictions, right? And so as we look at these things and the global movement of these goods, and then we can apply that to what could be impacting your organization, whether it's a simple trade restriction or it's a full regulatory requirement and reporting obligation. So that analysis is really critical in identifying your exposure risk to these situations. And then when somebody says, well, I buy domestically only, right? Okay, when did you sell domestically only? Well, yeah, I buy domestically here in the United States, and yes, I use metal, and I sell to customers domestically. Where do your customers sell to? Where do your domestic suppliers buy from? Why should I care? That's their obligation to figure out to make sure they're in compliance with these trade restrictions. It is, but then it impacts your continuity of supply. If you go to your supplier and say, hey, I need 3 metric tons of roll cold steel for a product that I'm about to sell into the automotive industry here in the United States, or heavy industrial equipment manufacturing in the United States, and they go, I'm sorry, my stuff got stopped at the border. I have no ability to showcase due diligence on the source of those goods, and that's why the U.S. Customs Department is dinging me, and they're demanding that I show country of origin and chain of custody on those goods. So when those get released, I'll be able to sell you something. Now you have to turn around to your customer and say, I can't sell you anything today because I can't get supply. And so this really all comes down to continuity of supply. From PFAS to trade restrictions and sanctions, making sure that the materials continue to flow. As the words famously say, the show must go on, right? So we got to continue to monitor those things, even if we don't think that we're directly impacted by those regulations.
Let me try to pick up on that point, because I'm very intrigued with it for the context of continuity of customer. So many businesses in the United States, and you named some, will have a reseller, potentially a sales agent, potentially a distributor. Those are all different legal definitions with different types of legal contracts. But my question is it the same legal obligation for the U.S. manufacturer who uses a distributor that sells outside the United States?
The question I get asked a lot by legal counsel is, let's go back to PFAS for a second. I read this regulation and I see that the importer has the obligation to report. Yeah, you're absolutely true. The importer has the obligation to report. My customer or my reseller, they're the importer, right? My distributor that I buy from, they're the importer. They have the legal obligation. Again, you need to check to make sure that you have the use cases of these materials, whether you're dealing with continuity of supply because of potential trade restrictions or use of PFAS and the obsolescence issues that come along there. If you're not keeping tabs on that, you may be out of a product overnight, right? And yes, there is reporting obligations that change based off of where you are in the value chain and what portion of the value chain you represent, i.e. oftentimes the importer or the exporter. You would be impacted by those and not have the ability to deliver the product. So in the case of PFAS, let's say, for example, you and I are two competing electronics manufacturers. We both buy electrostatic bags. We import motherboards from pick a location, right? And those are delivered to us in an electrostatic bag. I have inadvertently been sourcing a PFAS-free electrostatic bag for 10 years. I didn't even know it. I just asked for the spec of an electrostatic bag so that motherboard is protected. And you start going to your suppliers and making inquiries to identify if that bag is PFAS-free that you buy. And lo and behold, your bag has PFAS in it. And so you go, I got to find a new source. So you happen upon my source, and I represent a huge majority of that, the shipments, the ability to deliver product from that the capacity for that particular supplier. Now you are trying to steal capacity from that supplier from me. Now all of a sudden I may not have supply, and so I have to protect my capacity as well, even if the restriction, the trade restriction, the sanction on the steel, the restriction in the ability to support the sale of that material due to PFAS isn't on my reporting obligation because I'm going to be impacted by it because I'm a part of that value chain.
Let me turn to CSRD. Could you tell us what are some of the main or consistent questions you're getting from customers or what advice are you giving at this point?
Oh, yes. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe, that is a biggie. That is going to change the market on sustainability reporting and data collection in general. So the number one question that we get asked is, am I impacted by that? Am I in scope for it? And you go through the process. What is my size? What are my operations? And when do I have a reporting obligation based on my sale of EU? Let's actually go completely away from that for a second. Let's go back to the example of I buy domestically here in the United States and I sell domestically. Am I still impacted by CSRD? That depends on where my customers sell. So let's say my customer sells into the EU. And I go, I'm not going to be impacted by that because I have no reporting obligation. The legal requirement, as you said, changes depending on where you are, who you are in the value chain, right? I start suddenly getting these inquiries, and this language is very complex. And what those customers may be doing is taking direct quotes out of the ESRS standard, which governs CSRD, and asking their supplier, who asks you, because CSRD comes with a value chain element, both upstream and downstream, for data collection and input on their sustainability practices. And so it's hard-pressed for a company to say, I don't sell directly into the EU, therefore I'm not going to be impacted by CSRD. If you sell product somewhere and that product ends up in the European Union, then you are going to be impacted by CSRD. But obviously those companies with the direct reporting obligation based on their operations in the EU or their quantity of sales, their dollar amounts, are going to be impacted right away, and they have those reporting obligations. So CSRD is a driving force for the market right now.
Are there any U.S. equivalents to CSRD or laws, state laws that you're following, which you're having to advise clients on regarding their sustainability reporting obligations?
Everybody defaults to the SEC and their ESG regulation. I've heard Gary Gensler talk on the SEC's ESG regulation or proposed topic on ESG twice. And that's kind of gone back and forth. Is it going to have any teeth? Is it not going to have any teeth? But I'll tell you what. The bills to watch out for is the state of California, right? Governor Gavin Newsom signed the bill for SB 253, State Bill 253 and 261, and he sent it to the state legislature in the state of California. And California is the fifth largest economy in the world. And Google it. Maybe I'm getting it wrong. Maybe it's 6 now. I don't know. I've heard Phoenix here is fifth biggest city in the United States anymore, but I think it probably goes between 4 and 7 depending on what month of the year it is. So California, huge driving force. So you've got CSRD governing sustainability data collection and reporting through the value chain in Europe. You've got California looking at State Bill 253 and 261. Think of those two as bookends, and they're going to have huge impacts on the way that companies do data collection through their entire value chain, and then the way they report on sustainability. But these are good things. These are going to combat greenwashing. These are going to combat sustainability kind of bogus claims with no substance behind them. So actually what they're going to do is they're going to cause companies to really walk that talk in the world of sustainability.
Let me ask you, or maybe ask you to change your focus a little bit, Jared, to down the road. We are recording this post-election. We've obviously had a new president elected, a new administration coming in, perhaps regulating business in a little bit different way than the Biden administration. So I wanted to maybe ask you to look down the road on a couple of different issues. We've touched on this throughout the podcast already. We've talked about sustainability. I want to move it to ESG. And I want to maybe open the discussion with, and you ended by talking about, you've heard Chairman Gensler, who will be gone, talk about the SEC's ESG regulation, which will probably be withdrawn. But ESG is much more ubiquitous than that. And it's much more ubiquitous than even a regulatory framework, whether it be California or Europe. How does a company think through its business-to-business obligations around ESG, and where do you see that maybe going?
So at the beginning, when I introduced myself, I talked about the regulatory world, and then I talked about the market expectation. And this is where this is happening in spades, right? So we've got sustainability drivers out there, and then we've got the commercial drivers, okay? And where companies expect their supply chains to do these things. And that's the bigger driving force, obviously. You're always going to have the regulatory obligations, then you're going to have the commercial impacts. Take conflict minerals. Tried and true, good old conflict minerals, Dodd-Frank 1502. Been around since 2010. There is no enforcement by the SEC. Yet every public filer in the United States freaks out when they have to do their 10K every year and says, I got to do the Form SD and the accompanying conflict minerals report, the CMR, if I have products that contain tin, tantalum, tungsten, or gold in them, right? That regulation, zero teeth in the eyes of the law, huge commercially driven name and shame regulation, right? So you see contracts out there, B2B contracts. I will not do business with you unless you provide me transparency to my material sources of origin for conflict minerals. You see in more and more RFPs that have sustainability in them. And a lot of our customers come to us and they give us, I need this contract with my customer right now. Can you say yes? Working with you, can we say yes to these items on this RFP right now for sustainability? So that's the big driving force out there in the world of sustainability, is what my customer wants me to do. And most of the customers want to do that for a couple of reasons. One, for the potential of reputational damage and liability, right? I come to you and I say, Tom, I need to get some products from you. I need sheet metal from you. I need to make this housing for HVAC equipment. And you say, no problem, I can make that happen. If I don't come to you with, say, social accountability requirements in that contract, looking at labor, what happens if you're buying something from areas in the world that are known for forced labor, right? Making sheet metal isn't the cleanest business out there oftentimes, right? And now I've got reputational damage because I'm the brand, not you, right? You're my supplier. So that's why I need your cooperation in that regard. I build a brand kind of image around quality. I build a brand reputation around what I do for the people, the planet, all of those things. So I have to be able to walk that talk. And that B2B bit is such a huge driving force. The other big driving force besides regulation is investment, obviously. I work with a lot of different companies that are private equity backed. And maybe they have a goal to be sold or go public. And those private equity organizations won't even consider that until they have a very strong ESG program. And now oftentimes those private equity programs don't dictate, you've got to do this and this. I'll let you go your own way and do it the way you want. Think of Berkshire Hathaway, right? They have a sustainability requirement within their portfolio companies, but they don't dictate how those individual portfolio companies do it. And so even a private company has obligation, but you see all the big institutional investors and they'll look at ESG ratings in an organization. So it's not just that B2B customer to supplier requirement in ESG. It's also that I want to see your ESG rating as a company before I invest in you as well.
Let me turn to an area that people may not associate with its impacts directly on companies, and that's tariffs. And the incoming president has said he will aggressively use tariffs for a variety of reasons, both to punish our enemies and perhaps persuade certain companies or countries to do business with the United States, or perhaps to drive towards a reshoring of manufacturing in the United States. How do you see tariffs impacting companies, perhaps even in an indirect way?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, but believe it or not, it's been around for a long time. We're always dealing with tariffs, right? Look at Section 232 of the Tariff Code on steel. And now all of a sudden, it's not all of a sudden, it's several years now in the making, but companies need to reduce their reliance on certain producers of steel or Chinese steel. And so they have to verify country of origin. They have to verify how they're receiving those materials. You go to cbp.gov, right? And you look at the trade stats on their website. Number one revenue for the CBP is, you'll see the fines, fees, and tariffs. And you look at that since 2018 as it increased. I can't remember the number offhand, but you'll see from 2018 to 2022, those stats are available on there. And it's increased something like over $70 billion in that small period of time, because we've already used tariffs in the past to try to reshore efforts. And then there's even trade restrictions against the United States in attempts to reshore, like in the electronics industry, where China is trying to restrict antimony, germanium, gallium coming right here into Arizona, believe it or not, for the efforts to reshore chip production in the United States. And so tariffs are a really big deal, but without the proper data, you can't file for exemptions. You can't make sure that you can avoid those things. We talk about conflict minerals again. I'm going to use this example because it's actually really relevant to tariffs in the past. When we talked about conflict minerals in Dodd-Frank in 2016, and they said, is this really the right regulation? And there was talk about getting rid of it completely, but it was complementary to U.S. critical minerals. 40-some critical minerals that are critical to continued technology development in the United States and national defense. And they said, we should restrict the purchase through tariff of these materials from other countries. And conflict minerals really survived because it's so much critical minerals, in my opinion. That's why it continued to thrive, because you have to verify that country of origin. And so when we look at tariffs, it's so critical to make sure that you have a diversified sourcing, number one, and number two, that you can verify where that comes from, because you might not be the direct buyer of those raw materials. And again, that's why a good trade classification program and country of origin validation program through your value chain is so critically important.
Well, Jared, I've wanted to do this podcast with you for a long time. I think it's late enough in the year that we're able to take a pretty good look at some of the key issues you faced in 2024 and maybe look down the road to 2025. Hope we can continue this conversation.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Tom. And you're always welcome to come over here in Arizona and record one of these live with me.
And at the start of this podcast, the sponsor for the entire Compliance Podcast Network is Ethico. Well, Ethico has a great new offering this month for you, a toolkit for middle managers. This is something that you, as the compliance professional, can use to move your compliance program forward by giving middle managers the skills necessary to answer a call for speak up or when someone comes in their office and raises a concern. I can't think of a tool that will be more valuable for you in the current era of enforcement. 12 O'Clock High is an award-winning production of the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever great podcasts are listened to. And I hope you'll join me again for another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.